told you Jesus came to abolish religion? What if I told you voting Republican really wasn't his mission? What if I told you Republican doesn't automatically mean Christian, and just because you call some people blind doesn't automatically give you vision? I mean, if religion is so great, why has it started so many wars? Why does it build huge churches but fails to feed the poor? Tell single moms God doesn't love them if they've ever had a divorce, but in the Old Testament, God actually calls religious people whores. Religion might preach grace, but another thing they practice. Tend to ridicule God's people. They did it to John the Baptist. They can't fix their problems, and so they just mask it, not realizing religion's like spraying perfume on a casket. See, the problem with religion is it never gets to the core. It's just behavior modification, like a long list of chores. Like, let's dress up the outside, make it look nice and neat. But it's funny, that's what they used to do to mummies while the corpse rots underneath. Now I ain't judging, I'm just saying, for putting on a fake look. Because there's a problem if people only know that you're a Christian by your Facebook. I mean, in every other aspect of life, you know that logic's unworthy. It's like saying you play for the Lakers just because you bought a jersey. See, this was me too, but no one seemed to be onto me. Acting like a church kid while addicted to pornography. See, on Sunday I'd go to church, but Saturday getting faded, acting if I was simply created to just have sex and get wasted. See, I spent my whole life building this facade of neatness, but now that I know Jesus, I boast in my weakness. Because if grace is water, then the church should be an ocean. It's not a museum for good people, it's a hospital for the broken. Which means I don't have to hide my failure, I don't have to hide my sin. Because it doesn't depend on me, it depends on him. See, because when I was God's enemy, and certainly not a fan, he looked down and said, I want that man. Which is why Jesus hated religion, and for it he called them fools. Don't you see so much better than just following some rules? Now let me clarify. I love the church, I love the Bible, and yes, I believe in sin. But if Jesus came to your church, would they actually let him in? See, remember he was called a glutton and a drunkard by religious men. But the Son of God never supports self-righteousness, not now, not then. Now back to the point, one thing is vital to mention. How Jesus and religion are on opposite spectrums. See, one's the work of God, but one's a man-made invention. See, one is the cure, but the other's the infection. See, because religion says do. Jesus says done. Religion says slave. Jesus says son. Religion puts you in bondage, while Jesus sets you free. Religion makes you blind, but Jesus makes you see. And that's why religion and Jesus are two different claims. Religion is man searching for God. Christianity is God searching for man. Which is why salvation is freely mine, and forgiveness is my own. Not based on my merits, but Jesus' obedience alone. Because he took the crown of thorns and the blood dripped down his face. He took what we all deserve. I guess that's why you call it grace. And while being murdered, he yelled, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Because when he was dangling on that cross, he was thinking of you. And he absorbed all your sin, and he buried it in the tomb, which is why I'm kneeling at the cross saying, come on, there's room. So for religion, no, I hate it. In fact, I literally resent it. Because when Jesus said, it is finished, I believe he meant it.
Good morning. Good morning. I offered that video to you for a couple of reasons this morning. One of them is that we are talking about this concept of being contagious. This idea that this faith that we have, this story that we have to tell the people and tell our coworkers and our friends and our neighbors and our families is one that is contagious, that people want to hear this. That video was released on YouTube on the 20th of January. As of this morning, there were over 18.5 million views in just over 3 weeks. That's the definition of contagious and viral. That this guy came to just offer a message about his life in Christ, and people are just eating it up. And you know what? Your story is just as powerful as his. Maybe you don't do the hip-hop thing. I don't. I'm way too white to do that because I just do it really bad. But whatever way works for you. This morning we're going to look at a 2,000-plus-year-old example of a guy named Paul who did the same thing to tell a story. to talk about how Christ had worked in his life and how that became so infectious and so viral that it began to spread all across the Middle East, all into the Far East, all the way through Europe, and it has now come into America, and it's just everywhere. That this message of Jesus Christ is all over the place. This morning we're going to talk about this topic of how do we clearly communicate this message that we have to share with the world. This guy did a wonderful job of sharing the love of Jesus Christ. We're halfway through this series about sharing your faith with others and having a faith that people want to experience, and to tell them that in a way that they want to know more. I mean, wouldn't it be awesome? Stop and think about this. Wouldn't it be awesome if, starting right here from this room and upstairs this morning, if this thing began to spread like a virus, this love of Christ and this message that we have, and it began to go all through Dalton, all through Whitfield County, all around Georgia, all around the world, and we had this wonderful, great revival that happened all around the globe. The statistics say that only 40% of people in Whitfield County claim to be a Christian. Only 40%. And we live in the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. And yet only 40% know Christ. We've got this great message that we need to be telling people. And if we tell it right, people are going to hear it. And it is going to spread. We've taken on this idea of spreading like a disease or spreading like a virus to say, how do we share our faith in a way that we can share that with our friends without making them our enemies, and without making them mad with us. And we've said that to be highly contagious, and I think it's in your message notes there, it's the formula. To be highly contagious means, first of all, you need to be highly potent. You can't give something to someone that you don't have yourself. If you don't have a cold, you can't spread the cold to the next person. If you don't have a faith and a relationship with Jesus Christ, you can't help someone else find that. Does it make sense, right? Mm-hmm. Say yes.
Yeah.
Okay, just want to make sure y'all awake. Secondly, besides being highly potent, you have to be in close proximity. I can't spread a cold germ to you if we don't come in contact in some way. That germ passes from one person to the next. You can't share your faith with someone if you don't come in contact with anybody, right? Makes sense.
Right.
Today we're going to talk about what it means to communicate clearly. Have you ever heard, stop think that's why they call diseases communicable? Because we communicate them from one person to the next. It's the same with our faith. It can be communicated from one person to the next. And we're going to talk about what that means, just like this young guy did on this video just now. But no matter how strong the virus, no matter how close the carrier, unless that disease is communicated, it won't spread. No matter how strong your faith, no matter how closely you have relationships with people, if you can't tell the story of Christ in a clear and concise way that connects with people's lives, they don't care about hearing it. So we're going to talk about the importance of clearly communicating today. The power of communication and how communication can happen in powerful ways. It starts this way. It starts with a story. I want you to stop and think about that for a minute. Stories have the power to change people's lives. Who has ever heard of a guy named John Newton? You know who John Newton is? Wrote a hymn that you probably all know, Amazing Grace. John Newton was on a slave ship, and he saw these slaves in this hold of the cargo ship, this slave ship, and God broke his heart about that. So he wrote this song, Amazing Grace. A guy named Wilberforce heard about that in England, and he read that, or learned that song, and he heard about this plight of the slaves. William Wilberforce ended up being the guy who abolished slavery in the United Kingdom and then spread into the United States. How many people have ever heard of a guy named Everett Swanson? Who knows who Everett Swanson is? You ever heard of Compassion International? Everett Swanson was a guy who was in Korea. He saw all these orphans. And he said, we can do something about this. So he began an organization that grew into Compassion International. That now we can adopt children. Kathy and I have sponsored a child through Compassion International for 20 years now. And watched them grow up and their lives be changed because of a guy named Everett Swanson who told his story in such a compelling way that people wanted to be a part of that. Now you may be saying to yourself, yeah, but I'm not Everett Swanson and I'm certainly not John Newton or William Wilberforce. But let me say something to you. Your story is just as powerful As a matter of fact, your story is one that will reach people that no one else can reach, if you're willing to share it. You probably never heard of a lady named Lucille Minshew, or a guy named John Andrews, or another guy named Mike Arthur, or another one named Ellis Lee. But their stories were powerful. Their stories were so powerful and mean so much to me in my life that those are the stories that God used to lead me to become a pastor. And because their stories were so powerful in my life, and I have now become a pastor, your pastor, their stories are a part of your story. Stories mean something. They're real. They're powerful. And God uses them in amazing ways. So if you think your story doesn't matter, that God can't use it, let me say to you today, get over that. That is a lie. Satan will tell you that, and it's not true. So the first thing I want you to know, the first thing that we need to embrace and understand is that my story is powerful. I want you to say that with me. Say, my story is powerful. Now say it like you mean it. My story is powerful. And God will use it in a powerful way. So let's talk about how we do that in a contagious way. First of all, you need to be prepared to share your story. This morning we're going to examine how we can do that in powerful ways. First, and perhaps the most important thing you need in any communication is to know what you want to communicate. In other words, you want to communicate your story in a way that is clear. Clearly communicated. And you may be saying, well, I know my story. I lived my story. I know. But let me ask you, do you really know your story? Have you sat down ever and thought about, how has my life grown? How has my faith grown throughout my life? What are the events in my life that have led me to the place where I am right now? How has God worked in each of those events? Have you ever sat and just really thought about that? I think probably the most beneficial, the most growth part of my whole spiritual journey was when I was in seminary and going through the ordination process in the United Methodist Church, when I was forced to sit down and explain what I believe and why I believe it. And we would have to write papers. I wish you could see them. If you ever want to see them, I'll show it to you. The stack of papers we have to write for ordination in the United Methodist Church, proclaiming what we believe, how God has worked in our life, and why we believe what we believe. If you ever sit down and do that, it's a great exercise. Now, you don't have to write a 110-page thesis on the Lordship of Jesus Christ in your life. You can sit down and just say, here are the things that have happened in my life. Here how I have seen God work in those. And when you got that story organized and clear, it makes it easier for you to tell people about it. It's kind of have it in your back pocket and ready to share. Each time I've ever done that, it's been a growing experience. I want to encourage you to do that in your own life. This morning, I want you to invite you to turn with me to the book of Acts, chapter 26. We're going to see the guy that was the precursor to the guy we just saw on the video a while ago. A guy named Paul who knew how to communicate a story in a powerful way. And we're going to look at we're not going to look at all of chapter 26. We're going to look at selected verses, but I want to encourage you to go back and read that in your own time and understand that story more fully. But let me set the context for you of what chapter 26 in the book of Acts is. Paul had been arrested. He used to be a guy named Saul. He had this Damascus Road experience where he met Christ. Christ said, why are you persecuting me? And I've got a mission for you. I want you to go and spread the gospel all around the world. And so he began to do that. Well, he came back to Jerusalem, and all the religious leaders said, we got to stop this guy, so they arrested him. Well, Paul pulled the trump card of being a Roman, and he said, you can't persecute me because I'm a Roman citizen. This is a place ruled by Romans. So I have the right to go and appeal my case to Caesar. The minute he said that, they couldn't do anything to him. So they took him into custody, and he's at Caesarea, and he's been arrested, and he's in house arrest, waiting to be transported to Rome to appeal his case before Caesar. And he's before a guy named Agrippa, King Agrippa, who was the ruler over that region at the time. Now look with me at verse 1 through 3 from chapter 26. Agrippa said to Paul, you have permission to speak for yourself. So Paul motioned with his hand, and he began his defense. King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews. And especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. And when you first read those particular verses, the first time I read them, I thought, well, Paul's doing a little sucking up, trying to get a little mercy. A little brown nose and say, you know, King Agrippa, you're awesome, man, I love you. But there's a very important element that we need to understand that Paul is doing right there that we can apply to our own lives to say, how do we communicate our message clearly? What Paul demonstrates for us is that a contagious story begins on common ground. He was establishing common ground with King Agrippa. He said, you know these same customs like I do. We're both Roman citizens. We've got this kinship. And I've got a story to tell you that I think you're going to like to hear. It's a powerful story. So he made a personal connection with Agrippa before he tried to tell him anything beyond that. People feel connected to people when they can find a common ground. I mean, that's just basic relationship 101 stuff, right? I mean, we know that. To connect with people, and then they'll hear us more. The major problem with Christianity today, I believe this, the major problem with Christianity today in the church is that we're telling those people outside the walls of this church, in every church in America, if you're going to come here, you've got to dress like me, you've got to act like me, you've got to look like me, you've got to know the words that I say if you're going to be accepted by us. So many of our religious services are designed so that somebody walks in that doesn't have a religious background, they won't know what's going on. There is no common ground. Believe it or not, you know there's people out there that don't even know there's such a thing as an Apostles' Creed. Now, I know that may be a great shock for all of those of us who were raised in the Methodist Church, but they don't. I've got a great friend of mine named James. James comes to me last year before Easter, and he said, now wait a minute, tell me, Easter is the time that you Christians celebrate Jesus dying, right? This is a grown man, raised in Georgia. He didn't know that Easter was the celebration of the resurrection. That's the world out there. And we say so often that we don't have common ground with those people, and they can't find the connection with us. So a compelling story, a powerful story, a contagious story is the one that begins on common ground. We've got to put the Christianese aside. Begin to speak a language that they understand and find a way to connect with people who don't know Christ. Listen to these words from 1 Corinthians 9. You don't have to turn there with me. I'll just read them to you. 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul speaks as well. Verses 19 through 23. He says, though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I become like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I become like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I become like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I become weak, to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessing. Paul is saying to us, y'all, we got to find the common ground of the folks out there. We got to connect with them somehow in some way. And you know how to do that. It's a hobby. In fact, you have kids that play ball. I don't know what the common ground is, but you do. And that's how we begin telling the most contagious story of the world. Let's see what else we can learn. So first it begins on common ground. We're not going to read all these verses, but just kind of look there and I'll kind of give you a synopsis of it. In verses 4 through 6, Paul tells about how he had become the epitome of a faithful Jew. That he was the guy that would go out and persecute the Christians. He obeyed the Jewish law. He knew every bit of it. And he said, I was the best Jew that there ever was. In verses 9 through 11, he recalls how he persecuted the followers of Christ by tricking them into blasphemy. And then he would have them arrested, and then he would actually vote to have them killed for their faith. Beginning with verse 12, he witnesses about the time that he met Christ face to face on the Damascus Road. And in verses 19 through 23, Paul explains how he has sought to live out that calling that Christ has put in his life since his conversion. Here's what we can learn from that dialogue that Paul has with Agrippa in those verses. A compelling story, a story that means something to somebody, has an organization to it. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So not only does your story need to start on common ground, but it also needs to be clear and it needs to be organized. You ever met somebody that just kind of rambles? Okay. I have notes when I preach because I'm ADD, and if I didn't have them, I would ramble. And you'd be sitting there going, where is this guy going? I know you've met people like that. They're so excited, they want to share something with you, and yet they just ramble all over the place. And in that rambling, the message loses its power. So a contagious story needs to be clear, and it needs to be organized. And then you might say, I don't know what to say. That's what you say. Your story has a beginning, has a middle, has an end. This is Bill Hybels, who helped write the book Becoming a Contagious Christian, says that you have the BC, before Christ. Then you have the MC, when I met Christ. And then the AD, after I came to know Christ. The beginning, the middle, and the end. Some of you may be saying, well, I've always known Jesus. I don't remember not knowing Jesus. But I bet if you go back and you clearly organize your story and you think about it, there'll come a time when it became real and personal to you. And at that moment, that time, that middle, here's what I knew. Here's how I've experienced Christ. This is the effect it's had on my life. That story is real, and that story is compelling. People want to hear that story. Now look back at verse 1, and then I'll show you something else. Agrippa said to Paul, you have permission to speak for yourself. Notice what Paul does. It's kind of weird that they put it in here. Paul motioned with his hand. He said, yo, I got something to say. I want you to listen. He got everybody's attention. Now look over at verses 24 and 25. Paul says, at this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. You are out of your mind, Paul, he shouted. Your great learning has driven you insane. I'm not insane, most excellent Festus, Paul replied. What I'm saying is true and reasonable. Festus tried to belittle Paul. I can guarantee you, if you share your faith, there will be people who try to belittle it. At least they will be apathetic and ignore it, even if they don't try to belittle it. But what Paul reminds us of is that we have to be confident. He shows us that a contagious story must be told with confidence. Our theme scripture for this whole series has been 1 Peter 3:15. It says, always be prepared to tell why you have this great hope in your life. To tell it confidently. It's your story. No one can fight against your story. So we must tell it boldly. Oftentimes, though, we do that timidly, or we get too worried about being politically correct. Oftentimes, we struggle and say, you know what, I can't talk about Christ at my workplace. Yes, you can. It's your story. You can't get the bullhorn, stand in the elevator like that one guy in the video and say, you need to know Jesus. You can't do that. You do that to me, I'll throw you out of the elevator. And I wouldn't blame anybody else that would do that. But you can share your story. And if you live that life following Jesus, people are going to want to hear it. They will come up and ask you. And when they come and ask you, that's the open door, that invitation for you to share the love of Christ in your life and how it has made a difference. And God takes that and works in their life. Someone told you their story. That's why you're here this morning. And you can do the same thing for someone else. You shouldn't force your faith on someone, but you certainly should tell your faith. Paul could do that because he understood two things, and it's something that you need to know that's important as well. Paul understood who God is, and he understood who he is. We need to know that. We're not the ones that save people. That's God. And yet we're the ones that God chooses to tell the story. That's who we are. We're simply God's messenger, God's vehicle, God's conduit to share the story. I want you to stop and think about this for a minute. People can argue with you about all kinds of things. Christians are famous for arguing doctrine. We'll fight about how much water you're supposed to use when you're supposed to baptize somebody. We'll fight about all kinds of things. But nobody can argue about your story. Because it's your story. You're the one who's living it. And it's a powerful story. So I want to invite you, when you tell that story, don't argue with people. Don't even talk about doctrine. Find the common ground. At least we can say, you know what? We all agree that people should be baptized. I don't care how much water it is. Find the common ground. So make sure that you tell that in a compelling way, in a way that is non-confrontational. Now look at verses 26 through 28. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it is not done in the corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. Then Agrippa said to Paul, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? Paul understood that a contagious story relates to another person's life. That's one of the things that we need to do, is relate to that other person's life. So he said to the king, he said, I know that you know these things. It hasn't escaped your attention. You just need to make it real and think about it and put it in an order that makes sense to you. And then he asked him the question. He said, can you connect to that story? He said, I know that you know. One thing, and perhaps the most important thing that Paul asked Agrippa is, he said, do you believe what I have told you? And in verse 28, Agrippa says, look at that again. He says, Agrippa said, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? And then look what Paul says. Paul replies, short time or long, I pray God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains. So Paul says, whether you believe it or not is not my problem. The thing I'm asked to do, the thing you're asked to do, the thing Paul was asked to do by God was to go and tell the story. Just to share the story, and God does the rest. So a contagious story is one that points people to Christ. Paul would always point people to Christ. If you don't point them to Christ, you're only going halfway. Let me help you understand why I say that a different way. You can say to your friends at work, you can say to your coworkers, I got this great church. I want you to come check them out. I want you to come see this church. But if that's all you say, you're going halfway. Because here's the truth. The church will disappoint people. This may not be the church for everybody. You could say to them, you know what, we got this really crazy, weird guy named Kenny Ott, who's a pastor, and you need to come check him out. We got this other guy that's really awesome too, his name's Robin Lindsay. He preaches upstairs, Kenny preaches downstairs. You can point him to us, but I'm going to tell you what, we will disappoint them. Because we're humans. And we will mess up. So don't point people to the church. Don't point people to your pastor. Point people to Jesus Christ. That's the compelling story. Because people know pastors fall. People know that religions and churches will disappoint people. Christ has never disappointed anybody. So our story needs to point people to Christ. You know, we're a culture of storytellers. If you think about everything in our culture, it's a story. Movies are a story. Music is a story. Sitcoms, drama, all the television shows that we have, they're stories. Books, stuff you see on, even the, you know, I bought a video game for my granddaughter on an iPad called Where's My Water? Anybody play that? Just like crack the game. You can't even lay it down. It's crazy. But it's a story. Everything is a story. People want more than just information. They want to hear your story. That's why handing them a tract doesn't do a bit of good. Telling them your story makes a big difference. And when we clearly communicate that, God takes that and He does powerful, powerful things. So here's what I want to ask you to consider this week. Think about what your story is. Put that in some kind of clear, organized way. And understand that you don't tell it the same way every time. You tell it based on that common ground. And tell it confidently. Tell it so people understand it. And then let Jesus worry about the rest of it. And He'll take care of those things. I can make you this promise. If you like to live dangerously, like to live on the edge, if you'll pray that God gives you somebody to tell your story to, He will. Quickly. So be ready. Be ready to tell that story because God is doing amazing and powerful things. Let's pray together. Lord, we thank you that you created this wonderful story. The story that began before eternity and will go past eternity. The story that involved creation and us. And that we're just a small piece, just not even a blink of the eye in the story of eternity. We thank you that we have a part to play in that, Lord. We thank you that you love us enough to use us, to call us to share the great message. Lord, I pray we'd be faithful to that. That we would be people who would be ready to tell our stories. Tell them with confidence. Help us have that compelling passion, Lord, to share your love with those who don't know. It's in your name.